preparing to live stream webinar.
So is it just the five of us?
It looks like it's just the five of us so for now, and that's a good number. I know some other people who said they might turn up, and we'll see if they do. I'm keeping an eye on the attendees pane to promote them to panelists if they do. Welcome everyone. This is the third session of our at the Salem Center for Policies election discussion group. We're thinking through the current presidential election and trying to understand the beliefs and values driving our votes. We've again done two of these so far with a somewhat revolving cast of characters, some of us every time, some in and out, connected to the Salem Center for Policy at the McCombs School of Business at the University of Texas, Austin. I'm Greg Salmieri, and I'm moderating the group. So this week, a lot's happened. We had a vice presidential debate, and I want to spend some of our time talking about issues that came up in the debate. But I wanted to start by following up on a exchange Carlos and I had in our first episode, where really so much in exchange. I asked people about their stories and how they came to thinking about this election as they did. And Carlos has a trajectory on this that a number of people I know have, which is they were what might have been called never Trumpers in 2016, people who more often than not vote with the Republicans, and who did vote with but who were opposed to Trump. And Carlos, you described yourself as having a Republicans for Hillary mug last time around.
Actually, that's why I'm in his office, so I can show you this.
You still got the mug?
One of my students made it and gave it to me, so that was
But this election are planning on voting for Trump, and I've known a couple of mostly intellectuals, people who are fairly thoughtful and well educated, who have moved in this direction in this election. It seems like from the polls, although it's harder to know what to make of those, the general public's moving in an opposite direction. So I wanted to get a sense from you more of what's changed. Is it that Trump is better than you expected him to be? In your view, Biden is worse than Clinton? Something about just what's the trajectory there? What's the reason?
So starting from I think 2016, right? My point of view then was a point of view that I think a lot of us that tend to vote Republican tend to like the values that the Republican Party tends to support. We're very uncomfortable with. This was a candidate that did not necessarily fall under what Republicans typically look like in terms of their policies, their statements, and so on. And of course, was somebody that felt completely outside of the mainstream of what we expect our politicians to look like, to sound like, to act like, and a complete unknown in a lot of different ways. So I just felt that the amount of uncertainty associated with a vote for Trump at that point in time was just overwhelming, in my opinion. So I could not get myself, to get up, go to the polls and vote for a Republican in that situation. I couldn't vote. I was not an American citizen at that point, so I couldn't vote. But I know that in my household, my wife, for example, she did vote for Hillary. She was very excited about the idea of a female president. But not only that, of course, I had a lot of concerns about Trump then, but I also had somewhat of an admiration for the path that Hillary had took to be in that position. And maybe I think a lot of my friends that tend to be more to the right of me criticize me on me thinking that or equating Hillary to a version of the Democratic Party that I think I was particularly a fan of during the 90s. I think in the 90s, the Democratic Party under Clinton and Bill Clinton had a lot of positive aspects to it and things that I care a lot about. Like you could call that the sort of the third way that was very popular in many places in the world, or the president in Brazil at that point in time, that's where I'm from, Jacques Chirac in France, or Tony Blair in England, and Bill Clinton in the US, was this sort of idea that, the left and right, the old left and right is dead. There's this sort of like middle of the road now that maybe we disagree on little details of choices, but it's something, it was a path that I sort of admire a lot of choices that they made. So I expected Hillary to be somebody embodying more of those ideas. Again, I was very upset when Obama got the nomination in 2008 because I thought that would be Hillary was a much better candidate at that point in time, where Obama represented something that was a far step to the left at that point. I think, somebody with very little experience and so on. I had a very similar attitude towards Obama at that point in time. Anyway, so contrasting those two candidates for me was like almost like an obvious choice at that point to vote for Hillary, even though I think there was a lot of indication already of a movement to the left side, a more aggressive movement to the left side happening in the Democratic Party. Nothing overwhelming. I think a lot of my Republican friends like to point out that Obama was extremist in a lot of ways. He was very, I think, ambitious in the policies that he puts forward. But I think that the policies generally, the things that got signed into law, were generally not particularly extreme type things. I think that there were a lot of executive actions that I was very uncomfortable with. But in terms of policies, of bills that got signed into law, they were not particularly bad. Again, we can criticize Obamacare for a long time, but I wouldn't call those things extreme left-wing type of policies. All right, so now fast forward to now. Since Trump took over, and again, I'm going to premise this by saying that the things that I tend to focus on are things associated with the economy. I think economic growth is the most important issue in every single election, because that's something that touches everything. With growth comes everything, comes liberty, comes development in all sorts of ways, comes racial equality, comes everything. The richer we get, the better we get in all aspects, right? So I fundamentally think that the policies that have a higher chance of leading to economic growth is the things that I try to be more focusing on. From that perspective, President Trump has had a very good record. The things that got put forward in his administration were things that the bills that got passed into law were bills that were, center-right bills. There's nothing extreme about how he managed the economic side of the equation on his administration. So that to me is a big success story. Not only in the bills that got passed into law, but on the regulatory side as well, where I think there was a lot of regulatory reform that was needed, necessary, that actually helps. And there's a lot of data suggesting that has led to good outcomes in the past 4 years. The thing that's lost in this election is one of the things that I think is very lost in this election is that the people that has benefited the most out of the growth that happened in the last 4 years were people in the very bottom of the income scale. So, you won't see many people out there saying this, but President Trump has been actually very good for reducing income inequality in the country, which is something that, again, the left focus a lot on, right? So that's something that, again, reducing by raising standards in a lot of people. One of my favorite statistics out there is the fact that people love to say that the American middle class is shrinking. The American middle class is shrinking because people are getting richer, because we're moving up the thresholds, not because the poverty level is growing, poverty level is reducing. The middle class is being shrunk because people are getting richer, and not necessarily by moving into poverty. So, and that has actually been accelerated in the past 4 years. So that's something that I think changed my mind quite a bit. At the same time, I'm also very unhappy with a number of things that President Trump has supported and has pushed for. In particularly, the two major problems that I think has an enormous impact economically as well are trade and immigration. So the lack of pushes for, it's sort of a schizophrenic agenda for trade. I don't quite understand it. He wants to do some free trade agreements, but at the same time, fights to this tariff. So I don't quite understand the plan there, which makes me very uncomfortable. I'm somebody that is for open borders and open trade in all dimensions. I take no tariffs, no barriers. It's better for us. Why would I impose a tax? A trade barrier is a tax on American consumers, and that's just a terrible idea. So that's something that I'm very upset about. But at the same time, again, when I compare to what the other side has to offer me right now, the other side has moved left to the extreme that is not recognizable. I think the current Democratic Party is putting forward ideas in the economic sense that the economic side of the equation that are just very extreme. The ideas of the Green New Deal, the ideas of the types of taxation that they're trying to put forward and so on are things that are going to be destructive for our economic activity and for people up and down the economic ladder. And that's the main reason why I will vote for Trump come November 3rd.
So it's sounding like you're saying something that I've heard a lot of kind of policy wonkish leftists say. Also, though with a different judgment of it, right? Namely that, and this is one reason that some people think Trump's not doing as well at the polls as, or at least in the polls now as he would have hoped, which is that he ran on this premise of being very different from your standard Republican. He's not so much concerned. I mean, he would say some things about anti-regulation and so forth, but his main bully pulpit issues were immigration, if anything, anti the elite class. So I mean, to me, Trump in 2016 sounded a lot like Bernie Sanders. And he still sounds a lot like Bernie Sanders to me. But anyway, so this kind of populist who's against the standard line that the moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans, but particularly the Republicans, like that's supposed to be good for business and the economy. Trump's not that kind of Republican. But then, so the argument goes, once he got in office, he much more governed like that kind of Republican, at least with respect to the bills that were passed and what happened in the executive branch regulatory agencies. So what the EPA was doing, what the FCC was doing, and so forth. And it does seem like that's true as with respect to what happened. Whatever some people are upset about it because they wanted a guy who changed all that. Others are relieved about it. And I'm somewhat relieved about it, I should say. Although
let me add two things that I think also were bills that not only on the economic side, but there were also very centrist bills that got passed, and some of them with bipartisan support. There was an education reform bill, something that was an update to the No Child Left Behind, that came to pass with a lot of Republican and Democratic support, which again, that's great. That's the kind of things that we need, right? And the criminal justice reform bill. It's another bill that I think was actually very successful. It's something that is like, absolutely needed. And of all the protests that you hear out there, for me, the two things that are absolutely clear that we need to do something about, one is on the criminal justice side, the sort of extreme punishments that we have for certain offenses that are just not justifiable. And one thing that's still missing, things associated with like, qualified immunity and things like that we hopefully get to pass. Those are bipartisan type of ideas that I think a lot of people, I think that there's a bill in the House right now that is supported by Amash and what's the very extremist Muslim congresswoman from Minnesota, I think. No, yeah, I think it's a co-sponsor. The co-writers of the bill is like the Libertarian in Congress and the most lefty perhaps person in Congress, and that's again a great sign, right? So my point is that again, two bills that were very much like center, middle of the road, important things, and the types of things I would like to see a lot more of under any administration, really.
My impression of what's happened is different. I mean, I don't see the left as having gotten further left in the way that I expected it to. So I expected after a Trump victory, you would get a real radicalization of the left. You would get a lot more AOC types and Bernie Sanders types, and the party would really, radicalize in that direction. And what I see happening is the people who are of that point of view are noisier. But my impression of where the Democratic Party has gone is not steamrolling in that direction. And on the other hand, I had expected more opposition within the Republican Party to what I see as the worst aspects of Trump. So I see it as, we could talk about what things in him we like and don't. I mean, there's the policy ones, immigration and borders, where I really agree with you on. And also I agree on a lot of the regulatory state stuff, although he's done less on that than I would have hoped, actually. But there's also, how do we understand the style of ruling and style of speaking, which I think has a larger effect. And I see as a policy issue. And I've been really disappointed by the Republicans on that. On the other hand, you might say, if you're anti-Trump on immigration and trade, you're not going to find much to please you in the Democratic Party agenda. It seems like they've gone to his, I mean, if you look at Joe Biden's trade plan, it looks like it's relative to Donald Trump. So I find when the country shifts, it tends to shift. People have this idea that the two parties are so opposed, but the things that change in both parties at once. And on trade, I think that's happened. So let's bring some of the students in here. And any thoughts on the issues we've just been talking about? I know some of you are pro-Trump, or anyway, pro-Trump and pro-Biden is a little too strong maybe for anyone's point of view. I don't know. Some of you prefer Trump in this election, as Carlos does. I think I've said earlier I'm voting for Biden in this election, although not too enthusiastically. What are any thoughts you guys on Carlos's story of what won him over?
Yeah, I'd love to kind of ask a couple questions kind of before I kind of go into what's driving my vote. Yeah. So Carlos, you said, I think one of the big things that drove your vote was just mainly economic policy, and kind of things related to income inequality, et cetera.
Yes, exactly. So I think the evidence data of what happened the past 4 years, again, it's hard to attribute all that to policies. It's not something that I can say for sure, but I think that policies did help tremendously. I think that the tax bill of end of 2017 was a very important bill, and a lot of the sort of like reduction in the regulatory burden the federal government imposed on a lot of things were very important for the sort of increased speed of growth that we saw in the past 4 years.
Mm-hmm. And I say that just because I think a lot of times when we're kind of operating on this level, we're trying to compare our beliefs. Sometimes the information we're getting is just very different. So, I think I read sources like the New York Times and Washington Post a lot, but obviously they have like a very anti-Trump slant, and the way that they covered the tax bill and his economic policy and just his legislative record in general was just fundamentally different than maybe the way you get information. So that's something I'd like to note, just because I think from how I've understood it and my perspective on the economy was that a lot of the growth that happened under the Trump administration was kind of initially kicked off by the reversal of the 2008 recession under the Obama years. So things like the Economic Recovery Act, TARP, the stimulus bills that were passed then. I think under the Trump administration, there weren't, big stimulus or I think the big policy or the only real bill related to economy that I felt that had gotten passed that created growth was the tax cuts, like you said. And I think we have different perspectives on that. And so, yeah, I think that's something maybe if we could just get to the heart of, why, what our beliefs.
Let me give you an example of where I think, yes, you're absolutely right on the source of information tend to have slant, which is something that as a professor, I strive to, what we do in the Salem Center, I think regardless of our preferences from the point of view of how we judge things, I'm always trying to strive to figure out ways to create abilities for people to get information in a clearest way possible without the slant. We have to understand that the newspapers are in a different business than me and Greg are in, right? We're in the business of trying to really create information in a way that's unbiased. Of course, that's very hard. Even the most extreme, careful professor will have some bias. Everybody comes into any problem with a little bit of bias. But the New York Times, Washington Post, or the Wall Street Journal, or Fox News, of course, on the other side, they're going to have their own slant. One of the best ways I like to think about what you talked about in terms of growth is twofold. One is that the recovery under Obama was one of the weakest economic recoveries that we ever seen after a big downturn. Was something that was not as effective. So the stimulus bill of 2009, right? The way that money was, the way they want to propagate it to the economy, the way the help actually came in was something that a lot of economists still to this day have a hard time seeing how much of that actually kicked growth to, other than just like growth that normally comes back. Just like now, COVID hits us down. Without anything, growth comes back up again once things normalize, right? That's a natural tendency. But like the speed in which things recover after the financial crisis was something that was very, very slow. If you look at the predictions that the Congressional Budget Office was making about jobs, for example, unemployment, okay, throughout the 8 years of Obama, the predictions were always rosier than the reality was. So the reality was always worse than the predictions were, okay? So then if you look at in the end of 2016, okay, as the election's coming up, and you see how the Congressional Budget Office was putting forward, projecting forward based on the policies of the Obama years, what they were expecting to happen in the next 4 years, okay? The reality came way above what the CBO was predicting. So the conventional wisdom in 2016 about what was going to happen in the next 4 years was that actually a slower pace of growth than what you observed in the 8 years during the Obama years. Okay, and those are nonpartisan predictions. Those are predictions made by Congress, and then by the interventions of the Trump administration, you end up seeing, again, I'm not going to tell you that I know for sure that the sort of like increase in growth and increase in job creation was due to those policies solely. Could have been due to something else that, is hard to explain, but that did happen. That did happen in the sense that we exceeded expectations, not only in growth, in terms of economic growth, but also in terms of jobs creation. The unemployment, nobody actually could expect unemployment to get to such a low level as it did in January 2019, 2020, essentially. January 2020 was like something that we didn't think was possible, really.
Right. And it was just like one of the lowest levels ever.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And let me just point out that you mentioned inequality again, and that's something that again gets lost, right? A lot of the rhetoric around the tax bill in 2017 was, oh, this is just a tax cut for the rich, right? Mm-hmm. And because you're going to cut corporate taxes, and that's a terrible idea because you're going to help the big fat corporations, right? Well, it turns out that big fat corporations pay salaries, make investments, and reduce prices if they have lower taxes, and you see that happen. You see the amount of investment grow. You see more jobs being created, and as a result, you end up getting a situation where the strata of the population that most benefited in terms of and again, I'm not going to necessarily apportion that to that tax bill, but the data says that the proportion, the fraction of the population most benefiting from the growth in the past few years was the very bottom. So grow the sort of like the speeding growth on the average hourly pay in the lower fifth was growing very fast. There was the lowest unemployment for African Americans in a long time. There was the highest growth in income for African Americans in a long time, which again correlates to being a lower strata. So it's something that I think it's lost in a lot of the discussion because, and again, for political reasons a lot of time.
And I was wondering. Oh,
go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if I could jump really quick and comment on something he said. I think Carlos is absolutely right in that one thing. And I would further like to emphasize something that I see from the Democrat Party that I maybe don't see as much in the Republican Party, and something that makes me want to prefer the Republican Party this election over the Democrats is not only the economy or how well it did under Trump. It's the belief that how well the economy did or how bad it does is of lesser concern than some other things might be. And yeah, there are things that are more important than the economy, but generally speaking, the economy has, like Carlos said, ties to everything else that goes on in the country. Whenever people have more money, Hispanics have more money, Blacks have more money, women have more money in general. And I think under Trump, we've seen a lot of that. And what that is increasing, for example, on the Hispanic community, our earning power, our buying power in the economy, well, that's not nothing. I don't think we can chalk it up to just, well, there are things more important than the economy. There are, but I don't think a lot of good objections are raised in that regard, typically. And I would like to see from the Democratic Party a bit more emphasis on the importance of doing economically well.
Let me comment on this point so we can debate, and there seems to be some disagreement about what to attribute the good economy in the last several years to. How big a difference do you see between the Trump economy and the late Obama economy? In either case, how much credit does a president deserve for the economy, or do various measures do? And what do we make of the tax cuts and the deregulation? And I myself am inclined to think some of those things did, have an impact on the economy that was positive. But Carlos had the idea, and I think George is stressing it too, that the most important thing is economic growth, or one of the most important, but Carlos is saying the most important, because all these other things come from it. And George, you're pushing back against someone who would say something else is more important than economic growth. But I want to ask, does economic growth, along with many of the other good things we value, have certain preconditions, and such that bad policies could, on other issues, could be undermining those preconditions? So we talked about, and one that Carlos mentioned is immigration and trade. If part of what's good for the US economy is immigration and trade, you can think that disrupting that, making a less favorable environment for immigration or trade, will hurt the economy. Maybe it'll hurt it in the short term. Maybe not. It seems not to have hurt it so much yet. But if you imagine the kind of change where over 20 years, America goes from being a place that people from all around the world come, the best and the brightest people, to start up their own companies, and this is an engine of economic growth, and policies put into effect over 8 years create a sea change in that, such that we're no longer a center for immigrants. Maybe you're not going to see that in the economic growth of the next 4 years, but maybe we're going to be a very different kind of country 10 years from now. And I don't think that trade and immigration are the only issues where that's something to worry about. I think one of the things that a lot of us talked about as a real value about America in the first episode of this, we were talking about this, was the rule of law. And if you think that one or the other of these parties, and there are arguments about it against both parties, but if you think that one or the other of these parties is dangerously deranging or threatening the rule of law, that's a kind of thing where if that's ruined, it takes a very long time for it to come back. And it's not like that's something you can trade off against the economy, because a successful economy requires freedom, and freedom requires rule of law, real freedom. And I think the biggest issue I'm worried about with Trump is I think that he poses a real kind of threat to the rule of law in both his rhetoric, but it's not just rhetoric. When you're pressuring for political prosecutions, which is basically what he's doing, and then claiming that there are political prosecutions on the other side when there's not, I think, evidence of it. You're politicizing the courts aggressively, or trying to. And I don't mean in the judges, I mean in the Justice Department, in a way where I think that's the difference between a free country and a banana republic kind of country. And I think I'm very happy if I have to trade things off, to trade off what I think is a better tax policy in the next several years against just that, if there was only that one thing. Other people want to come in on this? I do want to move immigrate to the thoughts on the vice presidential debate, and I have a little exercise I want to try with them.
Yeah. So I actually have a couple points on this. So the first is I want to kind of comment on something that Jorge had said. So to clarify, I think, to give a little bit of background on my stance on this election, I'm more or less just identify as a Democrat. I voted in one election, 2 elections so far, and I've just kind of been a registered Democrat. So I think the one thing I would actually kind of agree with Jorge on is that he talked about kind of the Democrats don't emphasize the economy enough, and they kind of decide to focus on, I guess, individual groups. So they'll kind of talk about Trump and that, Trump isn't good for Hispanic voters, Trump isn't good for Black voters, Trump isn't good for women, et cetera. And I think they approach politics through this identity politics lens. And I think that they're forgetting that, there's that old phrase that James Carville, Bill Clinton's old campaign advisor, would say, it's the economy, stupid. And, I think that still applies. It's like the bread and butter issue. And like, before you get into the identity politics, that issue is number one. So I agree on that front. I think that Republicans talk about the economy more and they emphasize it to the right degree. I think where I push back is, I think maybe it's just because of the sources of the news I'm consuming. I haven't kind of gotten to work with the Salem Center yet, and, dive into the data myself and kind of get a completely objective look. But I think what Professor Salmieri said was very true, is that, we're talking about short-term growth versus long-term growth. There's a concept called the brain drain, where America's always succeeded, especially in a globalized economy, because we're attracting talent from all over the world. And so you might not see the effects of that within the first 4 years of a Trump presidency, but 10, 20 years from now, when immigrants and highly skilled workers are not coming into this country anymore, what are going to be the effects then? And the third point I actually had was related to fiscal responsibility. So I think going back to 2010, first couple Obama years when the stimuluses were getting passed, and kind of the deficits were high and staying high. I think the main criticism that actually kind of led to that big red wave in 2010 was that Republicans are the deficit hawks. We're going to bring the deficit down, close loopholes. That we're the fiscally responsible party, and they've had unified government for the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, significant control for the next two, and that didn't happen. Deficits went up. And is that good for the long-term health of the economy? Is one thing that a question I want to raise. So the floor is open.
Let me chime in on both of those things, Greg, just quickly. One, I absolutely agree on the long-term prospects. If I were, if I'm given the chance of being dictator for a day, I do two things: open borders, open trade. Those two things are the largest possible economic growth things one can do. I mean, there's like, if you guys read Bjorn Lomborg, he writes a lot about trade-offs and things that, when you compare different types of potential policies. The Doha rounds of free trade, there was something that was trying to put into place like a few years back, about 10 years ago, is something that would generate trillions of dollars of growth for the world. And, all the developed countries sort of kind of dropped that to some degree. And immigration is another one. It's like the $11 trillion question of like, if you let people move effectively, and it's just something that benefits us all very, very quickly. And it's unfortunate. I see neither party being a party of open borders, open trade, as Greg pointed out. So that's one. Two, I absolutely agree with you that the fiscal side of the issue is very serious. It's something that we have had now a sequence of populist type of approaches to the problem, basically saying, push to the future, push to the future. We'll talk about this later. Let's not worry about it now. That's not good. And I don't see any party trying to deal with that right now. A party that's trying to come in with, Green New Deal ideas that are going to cost us like $4 or $5, $6 trillion. I don't see how we address that, given the fact that nobody seems to be willing to touch on Social Security, on Medicare, on the things that cost us so much money. So I think both parties are really bad there. So let me be very clear in the sense that when I say that I'm choosing one candidate over the other, even one party over the other, I'm not happy about it. I don't like any of these parties. I don't like any of these people. I just have to make a choice because of the options that I have in front of me, right? And they're tough. Now, the third thing, just mentioning on the rule of law, again, I agree 100% with Greg on the fact that if you undermine the rule of law, that's something that you would break the institutional framework that we have. Things are not going to work well in the long run. Has Trump been somebody that pushes the sort of norms to points that I'm super uncomfortable with? Yes, absolutely. Have we seen now almost everybody trying to push things into limits that are giving me very uncomfortable? Yes. I think this discussion of back in the courts, the types of things that we've seen in terms of lack of prosecution of social unrest across the country, something that worries me a lot. Of like, wait a second, that's not, it's like prosecutorial choices. They're based on political issues, not necessarily on whether there are crimes being committed or not. If you burn a federal courthouse, it is what it is. I don't know if you have a potential political statement to make. That's not acceptable, period, right? That's not good in either side. And I don't know if I can make a very intelligent judgment right now, whether I see more of that going on one side or the other. But that's something that absolutely worries me.
There's also the issue of, it's not just, is it more on one political side than the other, but how close to the center of the party is it? That is, if there are twice as many people, let's say, who identify as left, who are anarchic and burning things, as there are who identify as right, but they're further from Nancy Pelosi than the ones who identify right are from Trump, right. Which one do you worry more about? And I don't know that it's true that there are more on the left than the right. It's hard to say. There was just this case of these people who wanted to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, right? So, but what I'm worried about is how close that is to mainstream Republican politics, and that we have a president who seems to me to be encouraging it. And yeah, I don't think you have any equivalent of that on the left, as bad as I think there are a lot of things are in the street writing on the left. There's there's so much more we can say on this, but I want to talk about
Can I make-
something in the debates, actually. And I think this will give us an occasion to come back to some of these issues. So one thing that bothered me about this last debate was that I don't think the questions were answered. They were good questions, a lot of them, but the candidates didn't answer them. In the debate between Trump and Biden, everyone was yelling and Trump was interrupting every 2 minutes. This debate seemed normal and sensible by comparison. You know, there's a little bickering, but basically it followed the format. But that to me highlighted that none of the questions got answered. So I thought maybe we could try to answer some of the questions. That is on behalf of the candidates that we prefer, that I thought were some of the hard questions that were posed to them. So I want to pose a couple of the questions that the moderator posed and ask, you know, people to volunteer to take them up. So I'm going to start with the first one to Harris. What would a Biden administration do about the pandemic in January and February? That is, this coming January and February, they just get sworn in. What would they do about the pandemic that a Trump administration wouldn't do? I didn't really hear an answer to that in what she said. Do any of you guys? What would you want to hear her say if you were for her, and that you think she could honestly say? Yeah, Brian.
This a bit. Hello everyone. I'm going to be voting for Biden in this upcoming election. I think the main thing that you'd be able to show as a difference between the Joe Biden Kamala Harris ticket and the Trump Pence ticket is that, correct me if I'm wrong and please do, I have heard the statistic that Donald Trump is the source of around 34% of the world's misinformation on the coronavirus. So I think just in terms of not spreading active misinformation and disinformation, I think that'd be the largest qualitative difference. And I'm someone who believes that stability is a very important thing. And so I think that the creation of stability, particularly during these extremely unstable times, is the thing that we need in this country currently.
Any other pro-Biden Harris responses to this? Things you think Harris could have said that would have been persuasive? Yeah, Semo.
Yeah, so a couple very practical things and then a couple more abstract ones. So the first was the Defense Production Act. So the Trump administration, actually, you know, let's take a step back for a second. So I think early on it was reported that Trump had first kind of learned about the dangers of the coronavirus close to early January of 2020, right? And I think when he was briefed on it then, the CDC wanted to have doctors in the ground in China. I think the Chinese government kind of faced a conflict of interest in that they don't want bad information to get out, but they also care about the public safety of the world. So I think one of the big pushes that Joe Biden, the Biden-Harris administration would have made is ensuring that CDC doctors be on the ground in China. I think early on in the pandemic, despite his rhetoric, I don't think Trump was hard enough on China. I think he could have put doctors on the ground, like I said. Trump was, in fact, in China in February and had said something along the lines of, you know, President Xi is doing a great job on this virus, and now he's constantly blaming them. So the second thing was the travel ban that he kind of touts. He says that, you know, Dr. Anthony Fauci, Deborah Birx cite it as the reason that we saved millions of lives. Personally, I don't think that's true. I think even post-travel ban, there were projections, several death and cases projections. In fact, in May, I believe the number that the Trump administration themselves was throwing out was 60 to 90,000. We're at 200,000 now. And beyond that, you know, the travel ban and rhetoric, you know, may sound okay. It didn't work. You know, 40,000 travelers from China came into the United States between the time the travel ban was enacted and early March.
Just
so,
one question on that point.
Yeah.
Does that number include the repatriating American citizens, or is that number just Chinese citizens or foreign citizens to coming into the United States?
I'm not entirely sure. So yeah,
but
I do think of disease spread. I mean, whether someone's a citizen or not, if the
doesn't matter.
point of it is to stop a disease.
Yeah, but I think
good.
Yeah, I think it's important to make a distinction though, because I don't think as bad as the disease is, how can the executive branch, in this case, prohibit the entrance into America to American citizens. I think it seems.
They actually have absolute
Yeah.
control of that, and they could have quarantined him.
Yeah,
But no, the
they
problem is that
could have.
40,000 people is difficult.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
I think so.
let's
Yeah.
return to that in connection with the next question about that one asked to Pence. I still think we've gotten an answer to this from you guys, similar to Harris's answer about all kinds of ways in which Trump Pence missed the boat or bad things they did, I think. But the specific thing she was asked is, what would you guys do in January and February, right after you get elected? You know, okay, whatever mistakes were made in the past, now what are you going to do better than what they would do? And I guess one thing that we could say following Ryan is, and this is what Harris did say, we'll tell the truth. Trump lied to you. He didn't tell you the truth. He downplayed it. We'll be telling you the truth in January, and you can trust him not to tell you the truth. That's if that's your view of the administration is. So that's one answer. We didn't get many specifics though in Harris's answer. Maybe you can't because, and Biden has said when he's asked about this, is we'll have to see what the situation on the ground is in January and February. I want to move now to the question that was asked to Pence, which is very related and gets into what you guys were saying, which is, so here's the question to Pence. Why is the US death toll as a percentage of our population higher than that of almost every other wealthy country? For example, 2.5 times higher than that of Canada. And it's in responding to this question that Pence said, well, we closed the borders really early. Trump made this courageous call. People thought he shouldn't have done it to close the borders. But it seems to me that's beside the point. We have a higher death toll than all these other countries. Some of those countries closed their borders. Some of them didn't. I don't think Canada did when we did, and yet their death toll is less, significantly less. Europe did later. I think some of the other Asian countries did later. So it seems like maybe it's better that we closed the borders than we didn't. Maybe it made no difference. Maybe it bought us time, which we wasted. Maybe the right policy would have been to not close the borders and do something else instead. But whatever one should do with the borders, seemingly something was done wrong, that we have more people dead per capita than otherwise like us countries. I didn't hear a real response to that from Pence. It seems to me that there isn't one, but if someone thinks there is a decent response he can give, I'd like to hear it. So go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. I think a explanation, a purpose for that, a reason for that is taking into account, or rather the lack thereof, taking into account the governmental structures of these other countries we're comparing ourselves to. So if, we're talking about European countries, maybe Canada, we know their governmental structures to be more powerful and centralized than in the United States, at least generally. And a lot of these countries, they could, aside from the size of other countries compared to the size of the United States and the demographics, the power which is held by the public officials who are allowed to make these decisions for citizens, I think is greater, and at least generally in other countries than in the United States. For example, people pressing to see for a national mask mandate from the president. I'm just not entirely sure that's constitutional. I don't think that's allowed for if a president can't do that. Even as far as the governors wanted to take their own prevention measures, there were a lot of, checks and balances that keep and preclude the people in power from making, these sort of decisions that may or may not have saved more lives. I think that's at least something we should think about, other than demographics and size of other rich countries and just the overall population. I think just the system of government is something that we ought to take a look at when seeing the effectiveness of the response given to coronavirus.
So is it the case that all of the countries that have lower death per capita rates than us, or most of them, took more draconian, heavy-handed approaches than we did? Sweden has a lower death per capita rate than we do.
So let me, can I chime in here? Chris had something to say too. I'm going to make sure that Chris joins in on that one. But I think it's very dangerous to make that comparison right now, because this is not over, number one. Number two, looking at just death per capita is, again, as a statistician, I have to remind people that correlation is not causation, right? So we have here other factors that play an important role in this. So for example, the age stratification of the population in play is incredibly important, right? So for example, Italy got hit really bad, mostly because Italy has a lot of old people, right? Third thing we have to be very careful with, how do we count who died of COVID? That's something that different countries have very different metrics of what they decide as a COVID death versus not. Sweden, the US, the UK are very lax in defining a death of COVID. Germany is like, no, that's not a COVID death. So it's with COVID. They are very restrictive about what they call a COVID death. So at this point, I think it's very difficult for anybody to make a statement about, okay, here's a policy, and this policy has led to fewer deaths for sure. I think for the most part, all the rich countries have similar sort of like levels of health, which by the way, the US has, the underlying health levels are worse than European countries. We have, more people that are obese, more people that are diabetic, more people that have high blood pressure. And those things tend to be strong comorbidities associated with COVID. So regardless of the response to COVID, we'll be probably in a worse situation, to some extent. So I think it's kind of like a bad tie right now across a lot of different countries. Moreover, the last thing I'm going to say on this is that the US as a whole, is really difficult to treat the US as one monolithic thing. If you take out New York City from the US doesn't look all that bad. We had a really bad event in New York City. By the time we learn about this, we had like 30-40% of people in New York City infected, which leads to an enormous number of deaths in New York City. That is just like the largest. We're talking about like something like per capita 4 or 5 times what happened. New York City is a little more, almost like 10 times larger than anywhere else in the world that we've seen, right? So, and to the point that Samir made about Trump's response or whatever, it's already, we have now indication that this thing was going around in January in the US before travel ban. None of that actually mattered. None of that mattered. So to some degree, I think that's if Pence were to level out to people, say, listen, it didn't matter what we did. Be honest, right? I don't think it mattered. This thing did what it did and is going to do what it's going to do. And to some extent, I think that we don't have the ability at this point to really say that, oh, the lockdowns in the UK are great. I mean, look what happened in Sweden, or what happened in Germany. Nobody can explain what happened in Germany so far. They didn't do anything really special. We were celebrating what was happening in Eastern Europe for a while. Oh, now it's catching up with them and they are getting a lot of deaths there now. So I don't think we're ready to make any statement really at this point.
Can I respond to that for a second?
Sure, and then Chris, come in, and DM, I don't know if you've just turned on your video. Is that a sign you're ready to chime in on this? All right, so let's
He's
have-
a medical student, right?
Oh, is there another participant? Oh, I'm sorry, I can see the people down there. Yeah, there you go.
I would just essentially add, it's really hard to compare countries for all the reasons that Carlos mentioned, but also I think a lot of other developed countries have ways of, making sure people have access to care, they pay less for care. And I think if you look at sort of what the US spends on public health measures before all this happened in comparison to those other countries, it's hard to say, because I think the best argument that you could make for, and maybe Biden and Harris should make this point, that our best bet to have prevented something like COVID from being what it was is to have some sort of not universal health care, but expand coverage for most, if not all people. I think it is important to know that the US is one of the only major developed countries that does not ensure that every citizen, every person in its borders, it has access to care. And with that comes those health disparities such as diabetes, obesity, you name it. And it's hard to say, again, if that is the cause of sort of what happened, but you have to put all that in context. That's all I'll add to as far as the COVID thing. That's all I wanted to say.
Chris, do you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, I think just if I was Mike Pence, I would be, I think, synthesizing what Carlos and Jorge said, right? The GOP is the party of states' rights. Historically, there you could debate whether that's true or not now, but the party of states' rights, and so left it largely up to the states to manage, and then if I were to, I could throw in a political dig as well and say, well, look, the Democratic states handled it the worst. And so that would be, if I was Mike Pence, how I would have responded to that question. I don't know that that is from a political stance that's how he should have answered the question.
That is, you don't know that that's how he should have, because you're not sure that it's true or a good argument, or you're not sure that it would have played.
No, I think it would have played to the base very well. I think that it would have towed the party line, so I think it would have been a good political answer. I just don't know that it would be accurate, right? New York was a hot spot largely because of the population density and because they got it early before we kind of knew what the hell this thing was, right? And by the time we wrapped our hands around it, they were already, the city was already on fire at that point. And at that point, it's a little bit late to be calling the fire department. And so, but from a political standpoint, that's how he should have phrased it, because at this point, they are largely just, I think, trying to shore up their base. There are very few, I think, undecided voters that are left in this particular election.
That would have been the King G answer for him to give, in fact.
And in fact, I would say that the same way that I think the question is unfair to say, oh, the U.S. did worse than other countries, because it's hard to compare, from the measures that took place. He could have immediately said, because Chris is correct, if I just take an average death per million of Democratic-run states versus Republican-run states, is a big gap. Democratic-run states have much higher death per million, significant difference. In fact, I gave this as a question in the final exam for my MBAs this quarter. I gave them this data. They had to run the regression and I asked, is this proof that the Democrats are doing worse? Well, no, it's not, right? Maybe there's other factors here that really have to be taken into account. We cannot jump to the conclusion, but I think I agree with Chris. If the question is going to be asked to him about, the U.S. did worse, well, if you take that as a premise, I'm going to say that Democratic states did worse than the Republican-run states. So. But those both are wrong. Both are not correct statements at this point in time.
So you can challenge. So the claim here is that the right response to this question, both in terms of it's a good argument, is to challenge the premise that America has done worse in terms of deaths per capita. I would agree. And the challenge is that we don't have the data to know that yet, because one, we're not through with the pandemic, and two, there's incommensurabilities in how the data is gathered across countries. Okay. Does anyone have a response to that, Samuel? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Ryan, did you want to speak? I realized.
I can speak really briefly on this one thing. Sure. I think one of the other factors that we do need to look at here is mask usage, and also cultural proclivities towards coming in sick to work, since those are two very specific things which America was particularly not equipped to deal with. For example, most American homes did not have masks in them before the pandemic, as well as I think it was recently I saw statistics saying that one of the best cities in terms of its COVID response has been Portland, Oregon, because the majority of the citizens have been wearing masks for tear gas purposes, obviously, but and because of that mask usage, there's been much lower incidents.
Samuel?
Yeah. So I think I kind of want to respond to Carlos's point regarding I think some of what you said about regarding the numbers, and I think that's absolutely true. I think the way you count a coronavirus death really matters, and I think that's not something that's given enough consideration. And what you said about it's not over yet. I think Eastern Europe is really getting hammered right now. And I think Israel was a country that thought they were out of the woodwork, but they weren't at all. And so I really agree with that. I think one point that Jorge made regarding, I think, government systems was that, if I think a lot of the problems regarding to COVID and why the United States was not able to handle this was just structural and fundamental problems related to our country. I think even if you had, ex-president, whoever it may be, I think the level of partisan polarization leads to, I think, people not trusting the information they get. I think there's a lack of trust in government. I think Carlos made a point regarding, I think, public health, and we have higher rates of, diabetes and heart disease, obesity, etc. So I think when you look at it from that angle, I think one thing that sticks out is how do you solve some of those structural problems, and which party is offering more solutions to solve those structural problems, right? So when it comes to public health, I personally believe the Democratic Party has done more to solve that structural problem. When it comes to just partisan polarization, I think you look at, for example, the Senate filibuster. I think that, for example, has fueled partisan polarization and the lack and gridlock, right? So I think you have to, I think it's not just a Trump issue. It's a matter of, these problems are structural. They're fundamental to our country. Who's offering solutions to those structural problems?
Let me just add one thing to this, but just because of personal experience that I've had the opportunity to work with city and governors levels officials in Texas during the pandemic, and it is atrocious. Our what I call the bureaucracy, the public health bureaucracy that we have in place, was just not ready for this. And when I say atrocious, I'm not saying necessarily that's like, we needed to have more, but just, again, it's something that comes every 100 years, right? So should have been super prepared for it or not. It's, in hindsight, it's easy to say, yeah, we should have spent all this money and having all this like response team ready for it. But like the city of Austin is one of the most prosperous place in this country, of one of the richest large countries in the world by a lot. And you know what? Completely not prepared to handle something like this. We don't have the people in place. We don't have the systems in place. Data collection exercises, just nothing. And in the beginning, they're like, oh, we need to start building test and trace procedures. Where is it? And we're in a Democratic-run place in a very, very blue county and so on. So I think it's beyond parties. It's just like we just didn't have this. We're ready for this. Maybe the funding mechanism is not there. And I think that when you compare to places that have dealt with more recently with problems of this magnitude, like South Korea, they had a bad scare in 2003, a bad one. And then, they build a lot of things. And again, South Korea is one city, right? Seoul, that's it. Everything else is very small. So I think, it was easier for them to build something in that location, fund it, and be ready for the next one. And they handled it very, very well, right? So yes, the system of, I think Jorge is right with the system of government aspect of it. The decentralization can hurt in situations like this. But also I think that we just didn't have it in all levels of government, I think. And hopefully we can get some lessons from this and move forward. And perhaps the Democratic Party might be better equipped to handle those transitions, but we definitely have some lessons to learn after this.
There's lack of coordination and there's lack of coordination. I mean, so it's true that for almost every government at every level in America, they weren't well prepared for this. There was one hand not knowing what the other is doing. There was confusion about how to do it. There was difficulties rallying things. There were decisions made too quickly and then backed up. But the level at which that was true in the executive branch at our federal government, I think, is, as far as I could tell, unprecedented in all of history dealing with any catastrophe. You have the president saying that what some of the doctors under him are saying is false and they're disagreeing. It should not be that Herculean a task to have the president and his subordinates be able to get on the same, and advisors be able to get on the same page, give a uniform message to the country, not change it every 5 minutes. So for example, either not promulgate the standards they did about when states were ready to reopen, or promulgate them and keep, saying this is what we want, or say we had these standards, but we've changed them for this reason and these are the standards now, rather than saying they should open under these conditions, then when somebody does, saying they shouldn't, and then when they do and they're not saying. I mean, the amount of mixed messaging and confusion I regard as a kind of epical failure of leadership. And I mean, imagine this in a military situation. I think, or in any other situation, I think this is a kind of leadership crisis that is, I just think it's how, I don't think that's about the Republicans or the Democrats. I think that's about this president versus pretty much anybody else in American politics who could have been in that office. I think Mitt Romney, Ted Cruz, neither of whom I love. I don't think you would have seen anything like this, or Hillary Clinton.
I'd like to kind of build on that point. I think what you said about failure in executive leadership is really important, because I think the point that Carlos made was that, we're in a very blue area here in Austin, but we haven't, been able to deal with it. And I don't think that's because of, I think it's because, we haven't gotten the resources from the top down. I think one big point that I would make was that the HEROES Act, which congressional Democrats passed or House Democrats rather passed in, I want to say June or July, that included critical funding for cities and states to deal with this pandemic, and it never reached those cities and states. And that was, I blame, federal Republicans for that, because the reason the cities and states couldn't deal with it was because at the highest level of government, Republicans blocked that funding from coming down.
I would like to add to that I don't think there's a lot of clear evidence that says that the more money these states would have gotten, the better, unless you're talking about economic relief, such as the stimulus checks. Leaving that issue aside of the stimulus checks, I think we really have to evaluate the premise that I think is implicit in most of our statements about coronavirus response. Does more money mean more help? Does more money mean less dead people because of the coronavirus? And does more money lead to less infections? I just don't think there's a lot of concrete evidence to support that. I think there was a lot of money thrown around, and I think this will serve as evidence in the future that, for the most part, and I think a lot of people know this in personal lives, but even for the government, you can't always fix a problem by just throwing money at it. I think that's an important point to make. I think a lot of states had a lot of money. Some states could have had more money. Some states could have used more money, but I just don't see a clear trend. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I just need to look at the numbers again or see different numbers. I just don't think there's any clear evidence that says that more money actually
And we're going to be able to see that the post-mortem of this, we're going to be able to study this a lot better. And I agree with Jorge that this is something that we have to be a little bit, unfortunately, getting the answer to what states, with the amount of money. Did California, they might have a better funded bureaucracy than Texas, right? If you think about the level of taxation in both states, you would think that California has a better funded bureaucracy than Texas does. Does that, has that had an impact? And we'll learn that later, but right now I don't think we're ready to make that statement yet.
Yeah, and can I just chime in 2 thoughts real quick? So one, I think kind of summarizing a couple of things that I've heard, I think a large part of the reason that this has been so bad for the United States is our sense of individual liberty, right? So the best way to combat this thing is to take personal responsibility and take steps to prevent the spread of it. And because we are a nation that thinks very highly of individual liberties and, oh, well, I don't have to if I don't want to, I think that has contributed. And what made me think of that is I was perusing Twitter, and one of their trending things over here is that Spain just instituted a state of alarm and have locked down like 9, provinces or something surrounding Barcelona. And then to Jorge's point about throwing the money around, it's not funny to me, but one of the big criticisms of the 2008 financial crisis is that we didn't act fast enough. Like, we could have made the fallout from it a lot less severe had we acted sooner. And history will tell, but this one is like almost like we swung too far the other way, and that we're going to be criticized for acting too quickly almost.
I'm skeptical of the part of the problem with America was that we value liberty or value it too much to take dramatic action. And so suppose that everybody wearing masks would be the best thing. If a country tried to mandate it, I don't think they'd be successful in being able to enforce it anyway. So I think, if people are going to wear masks, they're going to wear masks because they're sold on the need to wear masks rather than because of the law, one way or the other. I mean, there was slowness in people coming around to the mask policy because the science on it was ambiguous and still is a bit ambiguous, but people seem to be thinking, given what we know, overall it's best. And there, I don't think it's an issue of individualism or not individualism. It's an issue of, again, I think there's a real leadership crisis here. And if you look at one of the most horrifying things I've seen in American public life, because it was such a small example of this kind of thing, is when the CDC switched to recommending people wear masks, and Trump held a press conference the next day, and some reporter asked him why he wasn't wearing a mask. It seems to me there are lots of perfectly good things he could have said, like, well, I'm further away from people, I've just been tested, the reasons to wear masks don't apply to me, but obviously if I was in a supermarket, I'd be wearing one. But what he said was, I took the most horrible rejection of what I think is really behind individualism. What he said is, well, it's just a recommendation. You don't have to do it if you don't want to. But a recommendation doesn't mean nothing, like do whatever the hell you want. And I'm not recommending anything. I'm just saying some people like masks. It means we think there are really good reasons for you to decide to wear a mask. Obviously, you have to use your mind and decide how they apply to you, and it's up to you, but we recommend it for a reason. And my government that I'm the head of is recommending this, and I should be therefore following it and encouraging you to follow it. And if I'm not wearing one on a given occasion, have a reason, which again, I think there were plenty of good reasons for him, like the public needs to see my mouth, I'm the president speaking, lots of good reasons why he might not have. But the reason he gave was this kind of weird parody of individualism, that it's doing whatever you feel like without reasons. And I don't think there's anything individualistic about going by spur of the moment whims without thinking. What makes us individuals is our mind. And again, it's if we're going to wear masks, whether you have a law mandating it or not, that's not going to make everyone wear them all the time. What's going to make them is somebody able to build the view that, here's what we need to do to get through this. We need to all wear masks. It's a one step in the right direction. It's a patriotic thing to do. It's a small thing you could do. Again, whether masks are the best thing to do or not, there's a real need for a clear guidance from our leaders about what to do and why. And I think this president is uniquely incapable of that, of all people who've led any place ever that I can think of. Jorge?
I want to say that I think you're absolutely right. That one instance you're referring to where he could have had a lot of good reasons not to be wearing a mask, and he chose, in my opinion, one of the stupidest decisions he could have said out loud, he could have passed on to the press. I do think for the same reason, it's stupid for the same reason you pointed out. It's really a caricature of individual freedom. I don't think it was right. I think he could have done much better than that. On the other side, as a counterpoint, I'm just not entirely sure that that is as big a problem as people make it out to be. I think we really need to see some numbers regarding.
Is what you're saying is not a problem mask wearing or lack of leadership? I'm not sure just which you're talking about.
Oh, okay, yeah. No, there's definitely, I think, in your view, adopting that view, there's definitely a lack of leadership. And I think that's true for some part. I do think in either direction, he didn't take a proper stance, and he didn't lead the people or let them to be convinced of any particular stance, because he wasn't also saying, well, don't wear the mask, they're bad. He wasn't actually making any point. He was just saying, like you said, drawing up that caricature of individual liberty. I don't want to do it, so I'm not going to do it. It's just a recommendation. So yeah, I think that's a lack of leadership right there.
What you're talking about is how good the reasons are for mask wearing.
Actually, I wanted to the consequences. I would need to see some numbers that kind of confirm that the people who actually listened, or decided to draw up the same caricature of individual liberty in this way, however many people that was, which I don't think it's an overwhelming majority. I honestly don't think it's an overwhelming majority. Their lack of mask wearing, how did it affect the country? I think we need to see some numbers on that. I think it's going to be hard until this whole thing is through. I also, on the masks, you also got to think about the issues of, for example, masks like this, medical masks, the N95 masks, which are known to be the best ones you could have against COVID. These are just somewhat effective against COVID. And then you have your typical fabric mask, which by a lot of, studies have revealed that are almost 0% effective when you're talking about COVID, when you're talking about cloth masks. So you also got to think the emphasis that was put on whether you're actually just wearing a face covering for the sake of it, or are you actually trying to do something good, which is reduce the spread of the disease? And if your answer is you want to reduce the spread of the disease, I think a very important point to make always is that the only masks that actually work, if you're gonna wear a mask and you want it to work, you kind of need something that actually works, at least that has been proven to work, at least tangentially. I think that will reveal to be
part of the issue. I think wherever one comes down on this, I think we should be able to agree that a big part of the issue is there's not the kind of data on masks that we'd like to have. That is
Exactly.
about which masks are best, how good they are, in which circumstances, and so forth. So we're in a situation, as we are almost all the time in life, of having to make a decision on incomplete information, make
Yeah.
the best of the information we have, and then we might have disagreements about, well, none of us, I'm sure, know even all the information that's out there, and we might have disagreements about where that information points.
Yes.
Ryan and Simile, you seem to have things you want to say on the mask point, so I'll.
Yeah, Brian was just saying first.
Yeah, I just had a question of clarification for Jorge regarding the effectiveness of masks. As I understood it, the main function of a mask is for oneself, such that if you cough or sneeze, the large droplets from that will not pass beyond the mask. And so for the majority of,
I guess,
so that-
yeah, definitely. If you take that to be the main purpose of masks, that you're just, I guess, tangentially protected. You know, if you cough or if you sneeze, at least, you know, those big particles of that particular excretion, they're not going to reach too far. They're going to stay within you, right? At least those, you know, big chunks. And if you take that to be like the absolute purpose of masks, then yeah, you have a point. I think that does kind of prove wrong the point.
That was the point of the CDC when they switched to recommending them, right? So there was no one thought they were super effective at preventing you from getting it, other than N95s, and even those are. It's when it was thought, when the CDC came to think, and the WHO, that there was more asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic spread than they had realized. Then they started thinking, well, if everyone wears a mask, then if you have it and you don't know you have it, you're not going to be spreading it to the other people. So my sense is that there's been a kind of consensus that it probably helps on the outgoing way, is more minimal how it helps on the incoming way. And a lot of the changes of policy had to do with changes in the views about how many people there are walking around with the thing who don't know they have it, who might
we're just reducing probabilities. It's all about reducing probabilities, right? That's all we're trying to do there. And again, I mean, all this mass debate, the thing that to me, I mean, I'm wearing my trade-off t-shirt, right?
Yeah.
It's like, what's the damn cost? I never understood, you know, in the beginning, at least, like, cost is so little. It's just like, you know, it's not that intrusive. I mean, I hate teaching wearing a mask on campus, but you know what? It's still a low cost, right? That's the part that that's a terrible hill to die on in terms of fighting a political battle. And that, I agree with Greg on that. I think that the sort of, there was a bad, almost we faced a perfect storm here of the sort of bad leadership and bad style issues that Trump has had, right? Created like a more divisive and more partisan atmosphere. And then this thing hits. And then you see governments across the board taking actions that were unprecedented and arbitrary. That creates an enormous amount of suspicion on people. Like, wait a second, you're telling me that like I can go to the grocery store, but my kid cannot go to school, and I've just lost my job? And like, you know, I think a lot of people develop a really negative reaction to government almost right away, which then when you start thinking about the sort of like circular effect of like, now governments are flip-flopping on the mask. The CDC said no mask. Now they say mask. Now, you know, and then people start getting to their sort of like tribal leaders, right? Well, what is Trump saying now? And if Trump said it, I need to do it the way he said it. Otherwise, and I think that it was just almost a perfect storm of, I really think that the sort of like the lockdown actions created, again, it's unprecedented, and it was incredibly arbitrary. Like, oh, it's what's essential, what's not essential. That's something very difficult for a government to make a choice on. You know, what's essential for me or for you is very different than, you know, for a bureaucrat making the decision, right? So I think that just generated something that I think we're going to have to deal with for a long time, the sort of skepticism and sort of like antagonistic relationship between people and governments, going to be with us for a while, I think, as a result of this.
Jamil, last thoughts on the COVID issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the point that I'd kind of like to make regarding masks, I think when it comes to Jorge's point, I think we could have a very long discussion on the efficacy of masks, you know, what's ingoing, what's outgoing. And I think a lot of the analysis about what the true efficacy rate will be post-mortem, I don't know if we can do it in the moment, right? So I think that's just kind of something I'd like to touch on. But in regards to kind of the main issue of masks, I think it's just talking about on a, like, you know, a policy level of, you know, should we implement it, should we not, I think kind of sometimes misses the point. I think it's a broader issue of why are people not wearing them, you know, rather than just the policy thing. And so I think the main thing that really concerns me is just the level of partisan polarization. And it doesn't just have an impact at the legislative level. I think what you've seen more often than not, especially as the media environments kind of become polarized as well, is that has a cultural issue. And every issue now, even issues where we can find consensus, becomes a cultural wedge issue. And so the real, I think, where Trump failed, in my opinion, was that one is that there's a fundamental lack of trust in government. I think 11% of people approve of Congress. Even a president's approval rating oftentimes just falls along party lines, right? But what the real kind of, I guess, lack of leadership came in when he chose to turn this into a cultural wedge issue. I think because he believes that it's in his political interest to basically divide and conquer, right? If he can drive the wedge and conquer his base, he doesn't have to worry about. I mean, even when he was describing the coronavirus death toll, he said, if you take the blue states out, and it just, that I think that was very much the wrong thing to do. So I think when it comes to tackling this issue and because all we can do now is, how do we prevent a crisis like this from happening in the future? You have to go back all the way and trace that issue of polarization. How do you stop polarization? And I think if you figure that out, you stop these issues from becoming wedge issues, and you stop people from acting in kind of a perverse political interest.
I have
us back to the issue of, if it's true that America has fared worse than other countries here, and Carlos raises the question, do we know that that's true? That's a candidate answer to why. That we've become polarized around this in ways that other countries haven't, and therefore we weren't able to take a coherent. There may be several policies that would have been okay, none of them perfect, but we couldn't quite get our act together enough on them. I think the interesting claim is that Canada, which is very similar to us in a lot of ways, is 2.5 times less, or we're 2.5 times higher in our death toll than them. And I don't know if our way of counting deaths is that different from theirs. I mean, that I think that's the figure that was pushed by the moderator, and I think it would be worth looking into that and seeing how good we think that figure is. Because if that's true, I think there really is something to explain about.
Demographically, Canada is very different. The city density issues. I mean, there's a lot of differences. But honestly, I'm a little surprised given the, a place like Toronto, I think shares a lot to New York City, and somehow they escaped the.
And that's a big difference. And then I wonder, there's the particular thing of maybe New York was just when it got hit, the times, and so we would think about what is that number if you take out New York, and if you take out New York and whatever the worst city in Canada is, and try to get a kind of different kind of thing. All right, we've gone, I think now, as long as we should go on this for today. I think this was a really interesting discussion and a useful example of the kinds of issues one could get into if one tries to answer the questions rather than dodge them and go to one's talking points, which is what I think we see in presidential debates. And I think there's a lot of things that we all might have to follow up on and are thinking about this. How much stock should we put in these comparative statistics, for example? How much credit should we give Trump, or before him Obama, or blame in either case for the state of the economy during their terms? How do we weigh long-term and short-term considerations, even with respect to the economy? Should some of the things that are seen as other than economic issues, like immigration issues, rights issues, rule of law issues, how should they be related to economic issues, including how do they affect one another long term? Carlos brought up how a rising economy helps everything in one way or another. I've suggested that certain of these other kind of changes could undermine a rising economy long term. And then there's the question still about, on these other issues, how likely is one party or the other to, or one president or the other to ruin them, to change things. So these are things I think we'll take up with respect to different issues in future sessions.
I just want to say something that I mentioned today that I think is very, very important. And I think it was in response to something that who said it? I think Samil said it. When we're talking about, thinking about whether we can say that this was due to this particular set of policies from Obama or the things that Trump did and so on. And I said, well, when you look at the predictions that were made then and then the actuals, right? And what this group we're doing today and what we've been doing here is like, putting forward our views, kind of making a prediction, right? We have a prediction about what's going to happen to the world going forward if one candidate wins, the other candidate wins, and therefore we prefer one over the other because we think the predictions are going to come through. I would suggest that we try to, if possible, a year from now, meet again and have this conversation again, just to check, right? You have your aspirations and your hopes, and how did it pan out, right? Where are we a year from now? Because I think that's a very important exercise of civility as well to learn. I think that one of the things that Trump has shown me that's really difficult to handle is the fact that he doesn't seem to acknowledge learning, and that's like tough. Even Governor Abbott, right, with the mask situation, started without it, and now he's with his mask on all the time. And that's like, okay, I'm gonna pivot here. It's okay to be wrong and change it if that's something that might be helpful to my people, right? And I think the same for us. I think it's very, very, very important to be like, I'm happy to be completely wrong if it turns out that Biden wins and, turns out to be a great thing for the economy. I would like to see that and learn that and acknowledge that. And I think if the more of us do that, the better it is for the civil discourse out there.
Yeah, that's part of my own, whether we all ourselves are around to meet in a year or not, we should all be reflecting on this. And we should be thinking about how things we've learned are shaping our thinking now. So, when Trump won in 2016, I had expectations for what would happen on both sides of the political aisle and in terms of what policies would get passed. And some of them were satisfied and some of them were upset. Some things went as I thought they would, others didn't. And that has a real impact on my voting how I'm voting this time. I think it's the same thing with Carlos. I expected a way faster swing towards socialist type candidates than on the Democratic Party than I think we got. I think we basically got some move to the left, but the really hard left stuff rebuked in the primaries. And I expected more standing up to what I regarded as the worst in Trump in the Republican Party. And because those things happen differently, I'm seeing a fairly moderate Democratic Party running against a worst case scenario Republican Party as I see it. Carlos was expecting worse by his lights from Trump on the economic issues and got a lot better. And that's why he's now a lot more comfortable with Trump than he was before, and more worried about a Biden presidency. And notice that all of these judgments include both what we expect to happen versus what does, and also our values about what kind of country we want to be in. One that has fewer regulations or more regulations, more immigration, less immigration, et cetera. And then those two are going to come down to what we think the effects of that will be and what values we have.
I think just this again, we're talking too much, Greg, but I'm going to say something again. Is that I think Greg and I, we know each other. We've talked a lot about the values that we have and so on. I think there's probably very few values that Greg and I disagree on. Very few. I think we're very much aligned in most things in terms of preferences. And yet, we get to different conclusions when it comes to something like this. And I think that's very illustrative of I think there's a tendency of us thinking that, if you vote for this person or that person, you're on the good side or bad side. It's like, we're talking about two people that are incredibly close in the political spectrum, in the preference spectrum, and still might end up in different votes. And
although I think they're also, so there's a real lesson in that in general, although you and I are probably respectively very atypical Trump and Biden voters. Let's not congratulate ourselves too much on that. Any last thoughts from anyone else, since Carlos and I have been hogging the sum up portion of the show? All right, then I hope to see a lot of you guys back next week. Who knows what will have happened in the world between now and then, but there are lots of topics I have it in mind for us to take up connected to this election at some point, and depending on what happens, we'll see which are the most top of mind and most salient. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and thank you all for participating.
Good seeing you all.
Thanks, y'all.